money feels like something that has simply always existed. Coins, notes, numbers on a screen, quietly present in the background of almost every human interaction. But for most of the time our species has been around, money, in any form we'd recognize today, didn't exist at all. So let's start there, at the very beginning, in a world before money, and walk slowly through how humans first solved one of the oldest and most ordinary problems there is. How do you get something you need from someone else, when all you have to offer is something they might not want? The story usually told about this period goes something like this. Before money, people simply bartered. You'd trade a chicken for a sack of grain, or a pair of shoes for a length of cloth, swapping goods directly, one for another. It's a tidy story, and it's the one most of us were taught. But when historians and anthropologists actually look closely at the archaeological and historical record, they found something a little more interesting. Pure, direct barter between strangers, trading goods on the spot with no money involved at all, turns out to be a relatively rare, awkward way for a society to actually organize itself, and there's surprisingly little solid evidence that it was ever the dominant, everyday way people exchanged things before money came along. The trouble with barter, when you sit and think about it carefully, is what economists call the double coincidence of wants. If you raise goats and you want bread, you need to find a baker who happens to want a goat at the exact moment you want bread, in a quantity that fairly matches what you're offering. If the baker doesn't want a goat, maybe they already have enough, or maybe they'd rather have shoes. The trade simply doesn't happen, no matter how much you might want that bread. Multiply this problem across an entire village, let alone an entire trading network stretching across a region, and you can start to see why some more flexible system was almost inevitable. What actually seems to have come first in many early societies wasn't barter at all, it was credit. Long before anyone was carrying coins around, people living in small, close-knit communities kept track of who owed what to whom, informally, through memory, reputation, and social trust. If your neighbor needed grain during a lean season, you gave it to them, not because you needed something from them at that exact moment, but because you trusted that the favor would eventually be returned in some form when you needed something yourself. This kind of informal, memory-based credit system works reasonably well in a small community where everyone knows everyone else, and where reputations are easy to track and hard to escape. It becomes much harder to sustain once trade starts happening between strangers, across longer distances, where there's no shared history or social pressure to guarantee that a debt will ever actually be repaid. This is where some of the earliest formal records of exchange come from. Not simple barter transactions, but debt and credit recorded in writing. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the region we now call Iraq, some of the very first writing systems in human history were developed largely for exactly this purpose, keeping track of who owed what to the temple or the palace or to each other. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of small clay tablets pressed with a wedge-shaped script called cuneiform, recording debts of grain, silver, and livestock, dating back roughly 5,000 years. Many of the very earliest examples of writing we've ever found aren't poems or stories or religious texts. They're accounting records. Someone owed someone else a certain quantity of barley to be repaid after the next harvest. It's a wonderfully grounded thing to sit with. Writing itself, one of humanity's most significant inventions, seems to have emerged in large part out of the practical need to remember who owed what. Alongside this credit system, early Mesopotamian society also developed something economists call a unit of account, a standard measure used to compare the value of very different things, even when no actual exchange was happening. The shekel, a measure of weight roughly equivalent to a certain quantity of silver or barley, became a common reference point. The value of a house, a field, or a herd of animals could all be expressed in shekels, even if the actual payment, when it happened, was made in some entirely different combination of goods. This distinction is genuinely important and worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures something subtle about what money actually is. Money isn't really just stuff you trade. It's usually described as serving three separate, related functions. It's a medium of exchange, something you can trade for other things. It's a store of value, something that holds its worth so you can save it for later. And it's a unit of account, a common yardstick for comparing the value of very different things. Different objects, across different early societies, ended up filling these roles in different combinations, sometimes all three at once, sometimes only one or two, long before anything like a coin ever appeared. Around the world, in societies with no contact with one another, people converged again and again on a strikingly similar set of solutions to this same underlying problem. In large parts of Africa, Asia, and Oceania, small cowrie shells, glossy, uniform, durable, and difficult to counterfeit or produce in large quantities, became a widely accepted form of currency, used in some regions for well over 3,000 years, longer than almost any other form of money in human history. Cowrie shells had a number of quietly ideal properties for the job. They were small and light enough to carry in large quantities. They didn't decay or spoil, they came in a fairly consistent size, and, critically, they weren't something a local community could simply manufacture more of whenever they felt like it, since the shells came from specific coastal regions and had to be transported inland along established trade routes. That scarcity, and the difficulty of counterfeiting them, turns out to be one of the most consistently important qualities across almost every form of early money, regardless of what continent or culture produced it. Cattle served a similar purpose across many pastoral societies in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe, and this connection is quietly preserved in language even today. The English word pecuniary, meaning relating to money, comes from the Latin word pecus, meaning cattle. The word capital, referring to wealth or assets, has roots tracing back through a similar linguistic path. Livestock made a reasonably good store of value and a workable medium of exchange in the right context. Everyone understood roughly what a healthy cow was worth, and cattle could, in a sense, even grow in value over time by reproducing. But cattle are a clumsy currency in a lot of practical ways. They're not easily divisible, since you can't sensibly pay for a loaf of bread with 1/7 of a goat, and they're inconvenient to transport over long distances or hand over in small, everyday transactions. Salt offers another well-known example, and one that's left an unusually visible mark on modern language. In parts of the ancient Mediterranean world, salt was valuable enough, and useful enough, for preserving food in an age with no refrigeration, that it was sometimes used as a form of payment, including, according to a long-standing tradition, as partial payment to Roman soldiers. Whether or not that specific historical detail is entirely precise, the connection stuck firmly in the language. The word salary traces back to the Latin word for salt, sal, a small linguistic fossil preserving the memory of a time when salt itself functioned as a kind of wage. Perhaps the most famous and genuinely fascinating example of early money, though, comes from the small Pacific island of Yap in what's now Micronesia. For centuries, the people of Yap used enormous carved limestone discs, called rai stones, as a high-value form of currency. Some of these stone discs, quarried and carved on a different island and transported by canoe and raft across dangerous open water, grew to be many feet across and weighed as much as several tons. Here's the genuinely remarkable part. Because the largest stones were so massive, they were often never physically moved at all, even when ownership changed hands. A stone might sit in the same spot outside a particular home for generations, while everyone on the island simply kept track through shared communal memory and oral history of who currently owned it. If a stone changed hands as payment for something significant, a marriage arrangement, a peace settlement between villages, the community would simply update its collective understanding of who the stone belonged to. The stone itself never had to move an inch. When you sit with that idea for a moment, it starts to sound remarkably close to how a modern digital payment actually works. No physical object changes hands at all, just a widely shared, trusted record of who owns what, updated by mutual agreement. A form of money invented on a small Pacific island, centuries before any of us were born, was already quietly working on a principle that underlies almost every digital transaction happening right now. In parts of North America, wampum, belts, and strings woven from small shell beads, crafted by indigenous peoples of the northeastern coast, served both as a medium of exchange and as a way of recording agreements, treaties, and important historical events, with specific patterns of beads carrying specific meanings. European colonists, on arriving, adopted wampum for a period as a practical medium of trade with indigenous communities and, for a time, among themselves before European coinage became more widely available in the colonies. Grain itself, particularly in ancient Egypt, functioned for a long period as a genuinely practical, widely used form of money. Egyptian temples and granaries operated something close to an early banking system. Farmers would deposit their harvested grain into a centrally managed storehouse and receive a written receipt in return, a record of exactly how much grain they had on deposit. That receipt could then be used to pay debts, settle transactions, or be transferred to someone else, who could then redeem it for the actual stored grain. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's structurally very similar to how a modern banknote works, a piece of paper representing a claim on something of underlying value, held safely elsewhere, that circulates and gets exchanged as though it were the valuable thing itself, without most people ever needing to actually visit the storehouse and collect the physical grain. By the later Bronze Age, particularly across Mesopotamia and the wider ancient Near East, precious metals, silver especially, and to a lesser extent gold and copper, had become an increasingly common way of settling larger transactions and measuring value, precisely because metal offered a combination of properties that shells, cattle, salt, and grain each only partially provided. Metal was durable. It didn't rot, spoil, or wear away over ordinary use. It was divisible. A piece of silver could be cut, weighed, and portioned into smaller amounts for a smaller transaction, in a way a live animal simply couldn't be. It was relatively scarce and required real, meaningful effort to obtain, since it had to be mined and refined. And critically, it was fungible. A given weight of pure silver was, for practical purposes, worth the same as any other equal weight of pure silver, regardless of where it came from or who had owned it previously, which isn't really true of, say, cattle, where one animal's health and condition might differ meaningfully from another's. The catch, in this Bronze Age system, was that metal still had to be weighed and its purity assessed at the moment of every single transaction, using scales and, often, a trusted third party to verify the metal hadn't been mixed with cheaper alloys. It was an improvement over cattle or grain in many ways, but it was still slow, and it still required a real degree of trust and technical verification every single time two people wanted to trade. That particular problem, the friction of weighing and verifying metal for every transaction, is exactly the problem that the next major leap in the history of money was designed to solve. Somewhere around the 7th century BCE, in a kingdom on the western coast of what's now Turkey, someone had a genuinely elegant idea. Instead of weighing raw metal every single time, what if you pre-measured a standard amount of metal, stamped it with an official mark guaranteeing its weight and purity, and let people simply trust that mark, rather than re-verifying the metal from scratch with every trade? There are a few more early forms of money worth sitting with for a moment, because each one adds a slightly different texture to this picture of how humans, independently, again and again, arrived at broadly similar solutions to the same underlying problem. In Sparta, the ancient Greek city-state famous for its austere, disciplined way of life, the lawgiver Lycurgus is said to have deliberately mandated a currency of large, heavy iron bars, specifically designed to be impractical to hoard or transport in any real quantity. A modest sum of Spartan money might weigh more than a person could comfortably carry, and the iron itself was treated with vinegar during production, according to ancient accounts, making it brittle and effectively useless for being melted down and repurposed into tools or weapons. Whether or not every detail of this story survives perfectly intact through the ancient sources, the underlying intention, as later Greek writers described it, was strikingly deliberate. Spartan society wanted to actively discourage the accumulation of portable private wealth, and awkward iron money was, quite literally, wealth you couldn't carry very far and didn't especially want to. In parts of ancient Mesoamerica, among the Aztec, Maya, and other Central American civilizations, cacao beans, the raw ingredient of chocolate, served for centuries as a genuinely functional currency, used both as a medium of exchange for everyday transactions and, occasionally, as a unit for paying tribute to rulers. Spanish colonial records from the 16th century described fairly detailed price lists, denominated in cacao beans, a certain number of beans for a turkey, a smaller number for a tomato, and so on. Cacao had a lot of the same practical properties that made cowrie shells so useful half a world away. It was reasonably durable if kept dry. It came in small, easily countable units, and, importantly, it couldn't simply be grown anywhere, since cacao trees require a fairly specific tropical climate, giving the currency a natural, geography-based scarcity that helped protect its value. Salt shows up again here too, in a slightly different form from the Roman story we touched on earlier. Across parts of Ethiopia and the wider Horn of Africa, bars of salt called amole served for centuries as an accepted currency, particularly in regions far from the coast, where salt itself was a genuinely scarce and valuable commodity, essential for both food preservation and basic nutrition. Trans-Saharan trade caravans, moving between North and West Africa for centuries, are well documented as having traded salt, sometimes described as being worth its weight in gold along certain stretches of the route, in exchange for gold, ivory, and other valuable goods, with salt itself circulating as a genuinely trusted medium of exchange across huge, culturally diverse trading networks. And on the other side of the world, in the Solomon Islands and parts of the wider Pacific, some island communities developed an especially delicate and labor-intensive form of currency, feather money, painstakingly woven from thousands of small, brilliantly colored feathers, usually from a particular local bird, bound together into long, carefully constructed coils. Producing a single substantial length of feather money could take a skilled craftsperson many months of dedicated work, and the finished coils were used for major transactions, including, in some island cultures, as part of bridal payments. The sheer labor required to produce it functioned as a kind of built-in scarcity, not unlike the mining and refining required to produce a comparable value in gold or silver on the far side of the world. A few more forms of what anthropologists sometimes call primitive money. though there's nothing unsophisticated about the thinking behind most of these systems, round out this picture nicely. Across parts of West Africa, particularly in regions of what's now Nigeria, horseshoe-shaped bracelets of bronze or copper, called manillas, circulated as currency for centuries, valued both for their metal content and for their practical usefulness as raw material for jewelry and tools once melted down. A dual nature, currency and useful commodity at once, that echoes the earlier cattle and grain examples we discussed a moment ago. European traders arriving along the West African coast from the 15th century onward quickly learned to bring manillas of a specific size and weight as trade goods, since local merchants already had well-established expectations about exactly what a manilla should look and weigh, much the way any trader arriving in a coin-using economy would need to bring coins the local market actually recognized and trusted. Further east, across large stretches of Central Asia, Mongolia, and Tibet, compressed bricks of tea served as a genuinely practical form of currency for many centuries, particularly along overland trade routes far from any mint. Tea, unlike coins, was something people actually wanted and used directly, but compressed into a dense, standardized brick. It also traveled well, kept for a long time without spoiling, and could be broken into smaller pieces for smaller transactions. Properties that, once again, echo the cacao beans of Mesoamerica and the salt bars of the Horn of Africa. Tea bricks remained in genuine, practical circulation as currency in some remote regions well into the 20th century, a reminder of just how long several of these older physical commodity currencies continued operating in parallel with coins and paper money elsewhere in the world. There's one more early credit recording device worth mentioning before we leave this chapter, because it turned out to have a genuinely dramatic afterlife many centuries later. In medieval England, going back at least to the 12th century, the royal treasury kept track of tax payments and debts using tally sticks, simple wooden rods, notched with a pattern of cuts indicating a specific sum, then split lengthwise down the middle, with one half kept by the crown and the other half given to the person who had paid or was owed the debt. Because the two halves had been split from the same original piece of wood, their irregular break patterns would only fit back together perfectly with their original matching half, making the system remarkably difficult to forge, centuries before any of the more modern anti-counterfeiting technology we'll discuss later in this video. Tally sticks continued to be used, astonishingly, as an official part of the English Exchequer's accounting system for well over 600 years, only being formally discontinued in 1826. In 1834, in a detail that historians still find almost darkly comic, officials of the Houses of Parliament decided to dispose of 2 cartloads of these now obsolete wooden tally sticks by burning them in an underheated stove beneath the House of Lords. The fire, fed by centuries of accumulated wooden financial records, burned out of control, and the resulting blaze destroyed most of the old Palace of Westminster, leading directly to the construction of the iconic Houses of Parliament building that stands in London today. It's a genuinely fitting, if unintentional, monument to just how long, and how physically tangible, the record-keeping side of money's history has always been. That idea was the coin. And it's exactly where we're going to pick things up in our next chapter, the extraordinary spread of coinage across the ancient world, from a single kingdom on the Turkish coast to the vast trading networks of Greece, Persia, Rome, and beyond. Picture a marketplace in the kingdom of Lydia, on the western coast of what's now Turkey, sometime around the 7th century BCE. A merchant wants to buy grain. Under the old system, he'd need to produce raw silver or gold, and the grain seller would need to weigh it carefully, test its purity, and only then agree on a fair trade. It's slow, it requires trust and equipment on the spot, and it leaves plenty of room for dispute. Now imagine that same merchant instead reaches into a pouch and pulls out a small, irregularly shaped lump of pale gold and silver alloy called electrum, stamped on one side with an official royal mark. Both parties already know, without weighing or testing anything, exactly how much that little stamped piece of metal is worth, because the mark itself is a guarantee, backed by the authority of the kingdom that issued it. That's the coin, and it's genuinely one of the more quietly transformative inventions in economic history. Lydia, traditionally credited with producing the world's first true coins under rulers like Alyattes and, later, his famously wealthy son Croesus, solved the weighing and verifying problem in one clean stroke. A coin only needed to be checked and trusted once. At the moment it was minted, by the authority stamping it, and after that, it could pass from hand to hand through dozens or hundreds of transactions without anyone needing to re-verify its weight or purity each time. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's a genuinely elegant piece of social engineering. Trust, instead of being re-established at every single transaction, gets front-loaded once, at the point of minting, by an authority everyone in the region already recognizes and trusts. Everything downstream of that becomes dramatically faster and simpler. Coinage spread from Lydia with remarkable speed across the nearby Greek city-states, which sat right along many of the same trade routes and had every practical reason to adopt an idea this useful. Each Greek city-state tended to mint its own coins, often stamped with symbols closely tied to local identity and mythology. Athens, for instance, became famous for its silver coins bearing the owl of Athena, the city's patron goddess. Coins that circulated so widely and were trusted so consistently across the ancient Mediterranean that they functioned almost like an early international reserve currency, accepted well beyond the borders of Athens itself, simply because merchants across the region had learned, through long experience, that Athenian silver could be relied upon. This period also introduced something worth pausing on gently, the very human temptation to quietly cheat a trusted system. Because a coin's value rested on public trust in its stated purity, there was an obvious incentive for a cash-strapped ruler to shave a little value off, mixing in a bit more cheap metal or shaving small amounts of precious metal from the edges of existing coins before passing them along, keeping the shavings for personal profit. This practice, sometimes called debasement, would recur again and again throughout the history of coinage, and it introduces one of the oldest recurring lessons in monetary history. A currency's usefulness rests almost entirely on trust, and once people begin to suspect that trust has been quietly betrayed, they tend to adjust their behavior fast, often by trying to spend the suspect coins as quickly as possible while holding on to older, purer ones, a pattern later given a formal name, Gresham's Law, often summarized as "bad money drives out good." To the east, the Persian Empire, which came to control Lydia and much of the wider region, adopted and refined coinage on an imperial scale. The Persian daric, a gold coin introduced under King Darius the Great, became a widely trusted currency across an enormous, multi-ethnic empire stretching from Egypt to the edges of India, helping to bind together trade across an extraordinary range of cultures and languages under one recognized standard of value. It was Alexander the Great, in the 4th century BCE, who arguably did more than almost anyone else in the ancient world to spread coinage across a genuinely vast geographic footprint. As Alexander's armies conquered territory stretching from Greece through Egypt and Persia and into parts of India, his coinage featuring his own image, a striking innovation in itself, since earlier coins had typically favored gods and symbols rather than living rulers, moved with his empire, and continued circulating and being imitated by successor kingdoms for generations after his death. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the history of money. Coinage tends to travel exactly as far as trade routes, armies, and administrative systems reach, and once a particular currency becomes widely trusted across a large enough region, it can continue circulating and being copied long after the original political power behind it has faded. Rome offers one of history's richest, most thoroughly documented case studies in both the strengths and the eventual fragility of a coinage-based monetary system. Early Roman currency included the denarius, a silver coin that would circulate in one form or another for centuries, and the aureus, a gold coin used for larger transactions. For a long stretch of the Roman Republic and early empire, this system worked remarkably well, underpinning trade across an enormous, interconnected territory stretching from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East, with a genuinely impressive degree of consistency in what a Roman coin was worth, regardless of which province you happened to be trading in. Over time, though, particularly from around the 3rd century CE onward, a familiar pattern reasserted itself. Faced with the enormous ongoing costs of maintaining a sprawling military and administration, a succession of Roman emperors began quietly reducing the actual silver content of the denarius, replacing more and more of it with cheaper base metal while keeping its face value and its appearance roughly the same. Over several decades, the silver content of the denarius dropped dramatically, and the predictable consequence followed, as people gradually noticed and adjusted. Prices across the empire rose sharply, in a genuinely severe episode of inflation, as more and more debased coins were needed to buy the same goods that fewer, purer coins had bought before. The Emperor Diocletian, in 301 CE, attempted to address the resulting chaos with a sweeping edict setting maximum prices across a huge range of goods and services throughout the empire. A fairly early, large-scale historical experiment with direct price controls which, by most historical accounts, struggled to actually hold prices down and was eventually abandoned, illustrating a lesson that would recur many times in later economic history. It's genuinely difficult to control prices by decree once the underlying value of the currency itself has been quietly eroded. While Rome's currency struggled in its later centuries, coinage was developing along a largely separate, and in some ways remarkably stable, path in China. Chinese coinage, dating back over 2,500 years, took on a distinctive form: round bronze coins with a square hole punched through the center, allowing large numbers of them to be strung together on a cord for easier counting and carrying. Genuinely clever, practical design thinking. Worked out independently on the other side of the world from the Mediterranean coinage tradition. Following the unification of China under Qin Shi Huang in 221 BCE, one of the new emperor's sweeping reforms was to standardize currency across the newly unified territory, replacing a patchwork of regional coinages, much as he standardized weights, measures, and even the width of cart axles across the empire. A reminder that a unified, trusted currency has, throughout history, tended to go hand in hand with political unification and centralized administrative control more broadly. Following Rome's western half's gradual political fragmentation, one of its successor states in the east, the Byzantine Empire, managed something genuinely remarkable. Its gold coin, the solidus, first introduced under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century CE, maintained a strikingly stable gold content and value for well over 7 centuries, circulating widely across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and parts of Europe, trusted by Christian, Muslim, and other traders alike, largely because Byzantine authorities maintained unusually strict, consistent discipline over the coin's purity for an extraordinarily long stretch of history. It stands, even today, as one of the longest-running stable currencies in recorded history, and a useful counterexample to Rome's earlier debasement story, proof that the underlying problem was never coinage itself, but the discipline, or lack of it, applied by whoever controlled the mint. Meanwhile, as the Islamic world expanded rapidly from the 7th century onward, it developed its own influential coinage tradition, centered on the gold dinar and silver dirham, which came to facilitate an enormous interconnected trading network stretching from Spain through North Africa, the Middle East, and into Central and South Asia. Islamic gold dinars, much like the Byzantine solidus, earned a reputation for consistent purity that let them circulate and be trusted well beyond the direct political control of any single Islamic ruler, reinforcing, once again, that a currency's real reach is ultimately set by how far people's trust in it extends, not by where political borders happen to sit. In Western Europe, following the fall of Rome's Western Empire, coinage fragmented considerably, mirroring the region's broader political fragmentation into many smaller kingdoms and territories. The Frankish king Charlemagne, in the late 8th century, introduced an influential silver penny system as part of a broader effort to bring some order and consistency back to European currency, a system whose basic structure, a pound divided into shillings, further divided into pence, would echo through European monetary systems, including Britain's, for well over 1,000 years afterward, only fully retired with Britain's decimalization in 1971. Across the medieval trade routes connecting Europe and China, the network of overland and maritime paths we now collectively call the Silk Road. Coins from wildly different civilizations circulated, mixed, and were exchanged, often converted from one system into another by specialized money changers stationed in major trading cities along the route. These money changers, sitting at the crossroads of different currency systems, needed a genuinely sophisticated working knowledge of relative exchange values between very different coinages: Byzantine, Islamic, Chinese, and various European currencies, and this quiet, practical profession, developed to solve a very concrete logistical problem, was slowly laying the conceptual groundwork for something considerably more significant: institutions that didn't just exchange currency, but began holding, safeguarding, and eventually lending it. It's worth pausing on King Croesus of Lydia for a moment longer, because he left behind more than just an early coinage system. He left behind an idiom still used in English today. Croesus's kingdom, sitting as it did along major trade routes and controlling access to gold-bearing rivers in the region, accumulated a level of wealth that became legendary across the ancient Mediterranean world. So much so that the phrase, "rich as Croesus," was already circulating in ancient Greek writing not long after his reign, and has continued to be used, in more or less the same form, for roughly 2,500 years since. Croesus's story also carries a quieter, cautionary note that ancient historians like to emphasize. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Croesus, confident in his wealth and power, consulted the oracle at Delphi before going to war with the neighboring Persian Empire, and was told that if he attacked, he would destroy a great empire. He took this as a favorable sign. The empire he ended up destroying, as it turned out, was his own. Persia decisively defeated Lydia, and Croesus's fabulous wealth passed into Persian hands. It's a detail worth including here, mostly because it's a nice reminder that even in antiquity, people were already telling cautionary stories about the relationship between sudden wealth, confidence, and downfall. Athens' own coinage success was built on a very specific, very tangible piece of geological good fortune, the silver mines at Laurion, a mining district not far from the city, which began yielding unusually rich veins of silver ore in the early 5th century BCE. According to the historian Herodotus, the Athenian statesman Themistocles persuaded his fellow citizens not to simply divide a particularly large windfall from these mines among the population, as had reportedly been the more usual practice, but instead to use the silver to fund a substantially larger navy. That navy went on to play a decisive role in the Greek victory over a Persian invasion fleet at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, and Athens' resulting naval dominance across the eastern Mediterranean helped underpin the city's broader golden age of art, philosophy, and architecture that followed. It's a genuinely striking historical thread to trace, a vein of silver ore minted into those owl-stamped coins we mentioned earlier, indirectly financing both a military turning point and, later, a flourishing of culture still studied and admired today. Rome's own coinage carries a small linguistic legacy worth pausing on as well. Roman coins were traditionally minted at a temple dedicated to the goddess Juno, specifically under her aspect known as Juno Moneta, a name possibly derived from the Latin verb monere, meaning to warn or advise. Because Roman coins were produced at this particular temple, the Latin word moneta gradually came to mean the coin-producing process itself, and from there, through French and into English, it evolved into both of the words money and mint, meaning, quite literally, that the modern English word for money traces its origin directly back to the name of an ancient Roman temple. Coinage across this broader ancient and classical world wasn't only a story of stability and steady expansion, though it was also, from a remarkably early point, a story of ongoing efforts to prevent people from quietly cheating the system. Beyond outright government debasement, individual counterfeiters and opportunists engaged in a practice called coin clipping, shaving small slivers of precious metal from the edges of genuine coins before passing them along at full face value, gradually accumulating a private stockpile of stolen silver or gold, one tiny sliver at a time, from thousands of individual coins. This practice proved to be a persistent, difficult to fully stamp out problem across the ancient and medieval world, precisely because early coins were typically minted as simple, unadorned discs with nothing along their edges to reveal whether they'd been tampered with. It's a problem we'll come back to later in this video, in a rather unexpected historical setting, the Royal Mint of England, roughly 2,000 years after Rome first started wrestling with the same basic issue. Further east along the Silk Road, the Kushan Empire, which flourished across parts of Central Asia and northern India roughly from the 1st to the 3rd century CE, sat at a genuinely fascinating crossroads of coinage traditions, minting gold coins that blended artistic and religious imagery drawn from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Buddhist traditions all at once, a numismatic record, quite literally stamped in gold, of just how thoroughly these ancient trade routes mixed and blended the cultures that used them. And considerably further north and west, Viking traders and raiders across the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries developed a genuinely pragmatic, hybrid approach to money that nicely illustrates a theme running through this entire chapter, rather than fully trusting the stamped face value of every foreign coin they encountered. Norse traders, operating across a huge trading network stretching from the British Isles to the Baltic and downriver routes into the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, often relied on what's called hack silver, silver coins, jewelry, and ingots chopped into smaller pieces and weighed on portable scales at the moment of trade, essentially reverting to the older weighed metal system we discussed back in Chapter 1, whenever an unfamiliar coin from a distant, untrusted minting authority showed up. Large hordes of this mixed hack silver, sometimes combining coins from England, the Islamic world, and continental Europe all melted or chopped together, have been unearthed by archaeologists across Scandinavia and the British Isles, offering a wonderfully tangible physical record of just how far and how flexibly. Trust in money had to travel across the genuinely interconnected trading world of the early medieval period. Chinese coinage, meanwhile, continued to develop and refine itself steadily across successive dynasties following Qin Shi Huang's initial standardization. The Han Dynasty introduced the Wuzhou coin in 1118 BCE, a round bronze coin with the now familiar square center hole, which remained in continuous production, with only modest changes, for well over 700 years, an extraordinary run of currency stability and continuity, rivaling even the Byzantine solidus we'll discuss shortly. and a testament to just how effectively centralized, consistent minting practices could sustain public trust across many centuries. Coinage of this general style also spread, through trade and cultural influence, well beyond China's own borders, being adopted and adapted in various forms across Korea, Japan, and Vietnam over the following centuries. Is exactly where the next major chapter in the history of money begins. In our next chapter, we're going to follow that thread into medieval Italy, into China's remarkably early experiments with paper currency, and into the London goldsmiths whose humble deposit receipts would eventually evolve into the banknotes we still use, in one form or another, today. Let's pick up the thread we ended on, money changers and merchants, sitting at busy crossroads of trade, slowly becoming something more than simple currency exchangers. This chapter is really about one central, quietly profound shift in the history of money: the move from carrying valuable things around to carrying a trusted piece of paper that simply represents a claim on valuable things kept safe somewhere else. The earliest, and in many ways most striking, experiment with paper currency happened in China, considerably earlier than almost anywhere else in the world. During the Tang and Song dynasties, roughly between the 7th and 13th century CE, Chinese merchants engaged in long-distance trade began facing a familiar, practical inconvenience. Carrying large quantities of heavy metal coins over long overland trade routes was slow, cumbersome, and made a merchant an obvious target for robbery. Merchants in the Song dynasty developed a workaround, depositing their coins with trusted merchant houses in one city and receiving a certificate in return, which could then be redeemed for an equivalent amount of coin at a partner establishment in a distant city, or simply passed along to someone else as a form of payment in its own right, saving everyone involved the trouble of physically transporting heavy metal across the country. The Song government, recognizing the usefulness of this system, formalized it in the early 11th century, issuing officially sanctioned paper currency called jiaozi, widely regarded by historians as the first government-issued paper money in the world, predating similar developments in Europe by several centuries. Later dynasties expanded the practice considerably. By the time the Venetian merchant traveler Marco Polo visited the court of Kublai Khan in the 13th century, he encountered a fully developed paper currency system across the Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty, and wrote about it with evident astonishment for a European audience entirely unfamiliar with the concept, describing, essentially, an entire empire conducting its everyday commerce using pieces of paper that people accepted as readily as gold, purely because the emperor's authority stood behind them. It's worth pausing here on why paper money actually works at all, because it's a genuinely interesting question, and one that connects directly back to those three functions of money we talked about in our first chapter. A piece of paper, on its own, has essentially no intrinsic value. You can't eat it, build with it, or wear it for warmth in any meaningful sense. What gives it value is entirely a matter of shared, collective trust. Everyone accepting that piece of paper trusts that everyone else will also accept it, either because it can be redeemed for something of genuine underlying value, like gold or silver held safely by the issuer, or, later in history, simply because a government declares it acceptable for settling debts and collecting taxes, and enough people trust that declaration to act on it. Paper money, in other words, has always been a technology built entirely out of trust, dressed up in a physical form. China's early paper currency experiments eventually ran into trouble precisely along these lines. Later Yuan and Ming dynasty rulers, facing financial pressure, issued paper currency in excessive quantities without adequate backing, and the predictable result, much like Rome's coin debasement centuries earlier, was a serious loss of public confidence and a sharp episode of inflation, which contributed to China largely abandoning paper currency for several centuries afterward, not returning to it in earnest until considerably later in its history. While China was experimenting with government-issued paper money, a very different, more decentralized version of banking was slowly taking shape across medieval and early Renaissance Italy, in wealthy trading city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Florence. These cities sat at the crossroads of enormous volumes of Mediterranean and overland trade, and their merchants faced a genuinely practical problem. How do you safely settle a large transaction with a trading partner in a distant city without either party needing to physically transport a fortune in coin across dangerous roads or seas? The solution that gradually took shape was the Bill of Exchange, essentially a written instruction, issued by a merchant or an early banking house in one city, directing an associated banking house in another city to pay a specified sum to a named recipient. A merchant in Florence, needing to pay a supplier in London, could arrange payment through a network of trusted banking relationships without a single coin ever crossing the English Channel. The actual settling up between the banking houses themselves could happen later, in bulk, netting out many transactions against each other rather than settling each one individually, an approach that, in its underlying logic, isn't so different from how large banks reconcile enormous volumes of transactions against each other even today. The Medici family, based in Florence, built one of history's most famous and influential banking operations on exactly this foundation over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries. Beginning as wool traders before pivoting decisively into banking, the Medici established a network of branches across major European trading cities, developed increasingly sophisticated bookkeeping and accounting practices, and financed everything from ordinary merchant trade to the political and artistic ambitions of popes and princes, becoming, in the process, one of the wealthiest and most politically influential families in Europe. Wealth and influence built not on land or conquest, in the traditional medieval sense, but on the comparatively new, more abstract foundation of trusted financial services. Alongside this rise of merchant banking came a genuinely important, if unglamorous, innovation in record-keeping, double-entry bookkeeping, a system where every single financial transaction is recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a corresponding credit, in a way that keeps a business's books structurally balanced and makes errors or fraud considerably easier to detect. The system was formally documented and popularized by an Italian mathematician and Franciscan friar named Luca Pacioli in a mathematics text published in 1494, though the underlying practice had already been developing gradually among Italian merchants for generations before Pacioli wrote it down. It's a quiet, almost invisible piece of financial infrastructure, but it's genuinely hard to overstate how important reliable, verifiable accounting has been to the entire subsequent history of banking, investment, and modern business more broadly. You simply can't run a bank, a company, or really any complex financial institution at scale without a trustworthy way of recording who owes what to whom, echoing all the way back to those Mesopotamian clay tablets we talked about in Chapter 1. An earlier, less commonly discussed thread in the development of European banking runs through the Knights Templar, the medieval military religious order most commonly remembered for its role in the Crusades. Because the Templars maintained a network of fortified properties stretching across Europe and the Holy Land, and because they needed a way to move funds safely to support crusading knights traveling long distances through dangerous territory, they developed an early system allowing a traveler to deposit funds at one Templar property and withdraw an equivalent amount, using a form of authenticated letter at another Templar property much further along their journey, structurally quite similar in its basic logic. To the bill of exchange system, Italian merchants were developing around a similar period, and a reminder that the pressure to solve the "how do I move" value safely across long distances problem was arising independently in different forms across quite different corners of medieval society. The Medici weren't the only merchant banking dynasty to leave a lasting mark on this period. In the German lands, the Fugger family of Augsburg rose to extraordinary prominence through the 15th and 16th centuries, building a banking and trading empire that, at its peak, financed the Habsburg dynasty itself, including the enormous sums needed to help secure Charles V's election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1509. The Fugger story offers a useful, gently cautionary counterpart to the Medicis, a reminder that even the largest, most sophisticated banking houses of the pre-modern world remain genuinely exposed to the risk of a single powerful borrower, however creditworthy they seemed at the time, defaulting or delaying repayment, a lesson banking institutions would keep relearning in various forms for centuries afterward, right up through the modern era. A little further north, in the early 17th century, the city of Amsterdam developed an institution that many economic historians consider an important, direct precursor to the modern central bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609. Amsterdam had grown into one of Europe's great trading hubs, but its merchants faced a genuinely practical headache. The sheer variety of debased, worn, and inconsistent coinage circulating through the city, arriving from dozens of different minting authorities across Europe, made it difficult to know with confidence exactly what any given payment was actually worth. The Bank of Amsterdam's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Merchants could deposit their various coins with the bank, which would credit their account with a stable, standardized unit of account called bank money, based on a fixed, trusted weight of silver, regardless of the inconsistent condition of the coins actually deposited. Payments between merchants could then be settled simply by transferring the stable bank money between accounts, entirely on the bank's own ledgers, without any physical coins needing to change hands at all. This giro system, as it's sometimes called, gave Amsterdam's merchant community a genuinely stable, trusted unit of value to trade in, even while the actual coins circulating around them remained a confusing, inconsistent patchwork, and it strongly influenced the design of later central banking institutions, including, indirectly, the Bank of England some 8 decades later. It's also worth pausing, gently, on an early cautionary tale from this same general period and region, because it illustrates something important about the risks that can come with an increasingly sophisticated, paper-based financial system, the South Sea Bubble of 729. The South Sea Company, a British trading company granted a government-backed monopoly on trade with South America, encouraged widespread public investment by taking on a large portion of Britain's national debt in exchange for stock in the company, and its share price rose dramatically over the course of a few months in 1720, fueled by enthusiastic public speculation, before collapsing just as dramatically later that same year when it became clear the company's actual trading prospects couldn't possibly justify the price its shares had reached. The event became one of the most widely studied early examples of a speculative financial bubble, and it's said, with a nice touch of irony, that even Sir Isaac Newton himself, who we're about to meet in a rather different role, lost a significant portion of his personal savings in the collapse, reportedly remarking afterward that he could calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. It's a calm, useful historical reminder that financial enthusiasm running ahead of underlying reality is a pattern considerably older than any of the more modern bubbles that tend to get discussed today. Speaking of Newton, let's return, for a moment, to the much older problem of coin clipping we touched on back in Chapter 2, because it found a particularly memorable resolution in this same general period in England. By the late 17th century, England's silver coinage had become badly degraded through generations of clipping, to the point where the actual silver content of coins in circulation varied wildly and unpredictably, undermining public confidence in the currency, much as debasement had undermined Roman coinage centuries earlier. In 1696, the English government undertook what's known as the Great Recoinage, calling in the old, clipped, unreliable silver coins and reminting them at proper, consistent weight. Appointed to oversee this project, and soon afterward to the position of warden and then master of the Royal Mint, was, somewhat surprisingly to modern ears, Sir Isaac Newton. Yes, the same Newton, famous for his work on gravity and motion. Newton approached his role at the Mint with the same rigor he'd applied to physics, personally overseeing the technical details of the recoinage and taking an active, at times almost obsessive, interest in tracking down and prosecuting counterfeiters, reportedly conducting interrogations and gathering evidence himself. Newton also championed a technical innovation that finally offered a real, lasting solution to the ancient problem of coin clipping, milling, or engraving a raised, patterned edge around the rim of each coin, a design still used on many coins today, which makes any attempt to shave or clip metal from the edge immediately visibly obvious. A problem that had quietly persisted across coinage systems for roughly 2,000 years, from ancient Lydia through Rome and beyond, was finally addressed with a comparatively simple piece of mechanical design, championed by one of history's greatest scientists in what might be one of the more unexpected job titles of his career. It's worth noting, too, that the Bank of England's early monopoly on English banknotes wasn't quite as immediate or complete as it might sound. The very first Bank of England notes, issued in the 1690s, were actually handwritten and issued for large, specific, somewhat irregular amounts, more like a personalized receipt than the standardized, fixed denomination printed notes we'd recognize today, with fully printed fixed-value notes only becoming standard practice considerably later, in 1855. And England's banking landscape stayed considerably more decentralized for longer than many people assume. From the early 18th century through 1844, a large number of private and provincial banks across England, Scotland, and Wales issued their own banknotes alongside the Bank of England's, particularly in Scotland, where a system of competing, note-issuing commercial banks operated with a genuinely strong reputation for stability and prudent management across the 18th and early 19th centuries. An episode economists still study today as an interesting real-world example of what a more decentralized, competitive approach to note issuance can look like in practice, before England moved, through a series of 19th-century banking acts, toward the more centralized, single-issuer model most countries recognize today. Let's now shift to a slightly later period, and a development that leads more directly toward the paper money most of us would actually recognize today, the London goldsmiths of the 17th century. Goldsmiths, by the nature of their trade, needed secure vaults to store gold and other valuables. Wealthy merchants and landowners in London began, quite sensibly, paying goldsmiths a fee to store their own gold safely in these same secure vaults, receiving, in return, a signed paper receipt confirming exactly how much gold had been deposited and promising to return it on demand. The genuinely important shift came when people realized these receipts didn't actually need to be redeemed for physical gold in order to be useful. If a receipt from a well-known, well-trusted London goldsmith was clearly good for a certain amount of gold on demand, then that receipt itself could simply be handed over directly to someone else's payment rather than going through the extra step of redeeming it for gold first and then handing over the gold itself. Buyer and seller both save themselves a trip to the vault. This is, in a fairly direct and traceable way, the ancestor of the modern banknote. A promise, printed on paper, to pay the bearer a certain amount of underlying value, circulating and changing hands as though it were the valuable thing itself. The goldsmiths, watching this pattern unfold, eventually noticed something else, something with genuinely enormous consequences for the entire future of banking, because depositors rarely all showed up demanding their actual gold back at the exact same time. A goldsmith holding, say, 100 units of gold in the vault could responsibly issue considerably more than 100 units worth of paper receipts and loans, trusting that only a modest fraction of depositors would ever want their actual gold back on any given day, while collecting interest on the loans made with the rest. This is, in its earliest, most informal form, the basic principle behind what's now called fractional reserve banking, a bank holding only a fraction of its total deposits in immediately available reserve, lending out the remainder. A principle that underpins the vast majority of modern commercial banking today, and one that we'll come back to in more detail later in this video. This period of goldsmith banking and the broader growth of trade and financial sophistication across Europe set the stage for the emergence of formal, government-chartered central banks. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, offers a particularly clear and well-documented example of how this transition happened. The English government, needing to raise a substantial sum to fund a war against France, agreed to a proposal from a group of merchants and financiers. They would lend the government a large sum of money, and in exchange, they would be granted a royal charter to operate as a bank, with the privilege of issuing banknotes backed by that government debt. It's a genuinely interesting historical detail that the Bank of England, now thought of as one of the most established and stable financial institutions in the world, began its life essentially as a wartime financing arrangement between a cash-strapped government and a group of private investors. Banknotes issued by the Bank of England gradually became a trusted, widely circulating form of money across Britain, standing in as a stable, government-backed alternative to the sometimes inconsistent coinage and the more fragmented private banknotes that had circulated beforehand. A similar, though considerably rockier story played out across the early American colonies and the young United States. Individual colonies experimented with issuing their own paper currency, called colonial scrip, to address chronic shortages of hard coin, with distinctly mixed results depending on how disciplined each colony was about limiting how much it printed. During the Revolutionary War, the fledgling Continental Congress issued paper currency called continental currency to help finance the war effort, printing considerably more of it than the underlying economy could really support. Its value collapsed dramatically over the course of the war, giving rise to a phrase that entered the American vocabulary for a long time afterward. Something considered utterly worthless being described as not worth a continental. It's a vivid, very human example of a lesson that keeps recurring throughout this whole history. Paper money works only for as long as people trust it will hold its value, and that trust, once broken through excessive, undisciplined printing, is remarkably difficult and slow to rebuild. Out of these early, sometimes painful lessons, the modern concept of a national central bank, a single institution given formal responsibility for managing a country's currency, regulating its banking system, and acting as a lender of last resort during moments of financial stress, gradually took shape across the 18th and 19th centuries, spreading from early examples like the Bank of England to nearly every country in the world in one form or another by the 20th century. With paper currency now firmly established and increasingly backed by these formal central banking institutions, the next major question facing the world's economies became, what, exactly, should stand behind all of this paper, ensuring people continue to trust it? For a large stretch of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, the answer that much of the world settled on, at least for a while, was gold, and the rise and eventual fall of that system is exactly where we're headed in our next chapter. By the 19th century, paper money and banking were firmly woven into everyday economic life across much of the world. But a question still lingered underneath all of it, one that had lingered since the very first Chinese and European experiments with paper currency. What, exactly, guarantees that a piece of paper is actually worth what it claims to be worth? For a long, historically significant stretch, roughly from the early 19th century through the middle of the 20th, much of the world settled on the same answer: gold. The idea behind what's called the gold standard is fairly simple to state, even if its real-world consequences turned out to be genuinely complicated. Under a gold standard, a country's currency is directly convertible, on demand, into a fixed, specified quantity of gold. A pound, a dollar, a franc, each is defined, by law, as being worth a certain precise weight of gold, and, in principle, anyone holding that currency can walk into an appropriate institution and exchange it for that exact amount of gold. This arrangement offered a genuinely appealing kind of discipline and predictability. A government couldn't simply print unlimited paper currency, the way the Continental Congress effectively had during the American Revolution, because every note in circulation represented a real, specific claim on a limited, physical supply of gold sitting in a vault somewhere. It tied the growth of the money supply to the growth of the physical gold supply, which grows only slowly, through mining, rather than being expandable at the mere stroke of a printing press. Britain was among the earliest major economies to formally adopt the gold standard, doing so in 1821, and as Britain's economic and imperial influence expanded across the 19th century, other countries gradually followed, drawn by the appeal of a stable, internationally recognized, and mutually trusted store of value that made international trade considerably more predictable. If your currency and my currency are both convertible into a fixed weight of gold, then the exchange rate between our two currencies is, in effect, already fixed too, since gold provides a common, universally trusted reference point that neither of us controls unilaterally. This period, running roughly from the 1870s to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, is often referred to by economic historians as the classical gold standard era, and it coincided with a genuinely remarkable expansion of international trade and cross-border investment, aided considerably by the relative currency stability the gold standard provided. The system wasn't without real costs, though, even during this relatively stable period, and it's worth understanding these calmly because they help explain why the gold standard eventually gave way to something different. Tying a currency's value rigidly to a fixed quantity of gold also meant tying a country's broader economy to the same rigid constraint. If a country experienced an economic downturn, its central bank had comparatively little flexibility to respond by adjusting the money supply or interest rates, since doing so too aggressively risked breaking the fixed convertibility to gold that the whole system depended on. This meant that under a strict gold standard, economic adjustments during a downturn often had to happen through other, more painful channels instead. Falling wages and prices across the wider economy rather than a more actively managed monetary response. The First World War placed enormous strain on this entire arrangement. Fighting a large, sustained, expensive war required governments across Europe to spend at a scale their existing gold reserves simply couldn't support under strict gold standard rules. And one by one, the major combatant nations suspended gold convertibility for the duration of the war, printing paper currency well beyond what their gold reserves would technically have allowed in order to finance the enormous costs of the conflict. In the years following the war, many countries attempted to return to the gold standard, hoping to recapture the stability of the pre-war era. But the post-war economic landscape had changed too much for a clean, easy return. Britain's attempt to rejoin the gold standard in 1925, restoring the pre-war exchange rate despite considerable wartime inflation having already eroded the pound's real underlying value, is widely regarded by economic historians as a significant misstep, one that placed real, ongoing strain on the British economy through the later 1920s. When the Great Depression struck at the end of that decade, the rigid constraints of the gold standard made it considerably more difficult for many countries to respond flexibly to the resulting economic collapse. And one by one, through the early to mid-1930s, country after country abandoned the gold standard, restoring their central bank's ability to manage the money supply and interest rates more actively in response to worsening economic conditions. As the Second World War drew toward its close, representatives from over 40 countries gathered in July of 1944 at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new, more workable international monetary framework for the post-war world, one that could offer meaningful stability without repeating the rigid, brittle constraints of the old classical gold standard. The resulting Bretton Woods system, which would shape international finance for the following quarter century, worked a little differently from the pre-war arrangement. Rather than every country's currency being independently convertible into gold, only the United States dollar was directly pegged to gold at a fixed rate, while every other participating country's currency was pegged, in turn, to the US dollar. In effect, the dollar became the anchor of the entire system, one step removed from gold itself, with the US holding the enormous gold reserves needed to back the dollar's fixed convertibility. The conference also established two new institutions still central to international finance today: the International Monetary Fund, intended to help countries manage short-term balance of payments difficulties, and the World Bank, focused on financing longer-term post-war reconstruction and, later, broader international development. The Bretton Woods system worked reasonably well for a couple of decades, coinciding with a substantial period of post-war economic growth and expanding international trade across much of the non-communist world. But it carried a structural tension within it, one that economists at the time were already beginning to identify and discuss, sometimes referred to as the Triffin dilemma, after the economist Robert Triffin, who articulated it clearly in the early 1960s. Because the dollar functioned as the world's primary reserve currency, other countries needed a steadily growing supply of dollars to support the expanding volume of global trade and to hold as reserves. But the more dollars the United States issued to meet that growing global demand, the harder it became, arithmetically, for the US. Gold reserves to plausibly back every single one of those dollars at the fixed, promised conversion rate. It was, in a sense, a scaled-up version of the exact same trust problem that had shown up again and again throughout this whole history, from Roman coin debasement to Yuan dynasty paper money to the continental currency in revolutionary America, just now playing out at the level of an entire global monetary system. By the late 1960s, the gap between the growing volume of dollars held internationally and the relatively fixed quantity of US gold reserves had widened considerably, and confidence in the dollar's fixed gold convertibility gradually began to soften among some of America's major trading partners. Matters came to a head in August of 1971, when President Richard Nixon announced, in a televised address, that the United States would suspend the direct convertibility of dollars into gold, an event that's come to be known, somewhat dramatically, as the Nixon shock. It was initially framed at the time as a temporary measure, but it effectively marked the permanent end of the Bretton Woods system, and with it, the end of any major world currency being directly, formally backed by a fixed quantity of gold. What replaced it, gradually, over the course of the 1970s, was the system the world largely still operates under today, fiat currency, with floating exchange rates. The word fiat here simply means by decree. A fiat currency has value not because it's backed by, or convertible into, some fixed quantity of a physical commodity like gold, but because a government declares it legal tender, requires it for the payment of taxes, and, crucially, because enough people collectively trust that everyone else will keep accepting it in exchange for real goods, services, and labor. Under this newer system, currencies float freely against one another on international markets, their relative value shifting continuously based on things like relative interest rates, trade balances, and overall investor confidence, rather than being fixed to a shared gold anchor. It's worth pausing here calmly on something that can initially feel a little unsettling the first time you really sit with it. Modern money, in this fiat system, isn't backed by gold or by any other physical commodity sitting safely in a vault somewhere. It's backed essentially by trust. Trust in the issuing government's stability, trust in its central bank's competence and discipline, and trust that other people, businesses, and institutions will keep accepting that currency in exchange for real things tomorrow, the way they do today. This can sound less solid than a gold-backed system at first glance, but it's worth remembering something we've traced across every single chapter of this video so far. Even gold-backed money and government-stamped coins before it, and cowrie shells and cattle before that, were always ultimately systems of shared trust, dressed up in different physical or institutional forms. Gold itself only has value because enough people across history have collectively agreed that it does. It can't be eaten, and beyond some genuinely useful but comparatively minor industrial and decorative applications, its value has always rested overwhelmingly on shared human belief and convention, not on some inherent, self-evident usefulness. What actually changed in 1971 wasn't the underlying nature of money. It had always ultimately rested on trust. It was simply which specific object that trust was anchored to. Instead of trust in a fixed weight of a scarce yellow metal, trust shifted to a more direct, more flexible trust in institutions, central banks, and the ongoing, cooperative behavior of an entire economy. This modern fiat system does give central banks considerably more flexibility to actively manage their economies, adjusting interest rates and the money supply in response to unemployment, inflation, and broader economic conditions without being rigidly constrained by a fixed gold reserve. That flexibility comes with a real, corresponding responsibility, though, echoing every debasement story we've walked through in this video. A central bank that manages this flexibility poorly, by expanding the money supply too aggressively relative to genuine economic growth, risks the same basic outcome that debased Roman coins and overprinted continental currency once produced: a gradual, sometimes painful erosion of public trust in the currency's value, reflected in rising prices across the economy. Most modern central banks, having absorbed these historical lessons quite deliberately, now operate with fairly explicit inflation targets and a considerable degree of institutional independence from short-term political pressure, specifically designed to try to strike a careful, ongoing balance between economic flexibility and long-term monetary discipline. Let's rewind slightly and add a little more texture to the American experience of the gold standard, because it turned into a genuinely significant political and cultural debate in its own right, well beyond just the technical mechanics of currency. The newly formed United States, through much of the 19th century, actually operated under a bimetallic standard, with the dollar defined in terms of both gold and silver simultaneously, following the Coinage Act of 1792, which established the U.S. Mint and set out the young nation's first formal currency system. Maintaining a stable, workable exchange rate between two different metals, each fluctuating somewhat independently in relative supply and market value, proved to be a persistent technical headache, and the discovery of major new gold deposits in California in 1848 and later in Australia and elsewhere added further strain, periodically flooding the market with new gold and unsettling the delicate balance the bimetallic system depended on. By the later 19th century, the United States had effectively moved toward a gold standard alone, a shift that became a genuinely heated political issue, particularly for farmers and debtors in rural, agricultural regions of the country, who generally favored a more flexible, silver-inclusive currency, believing it would ease their debt burdens and support higher agricultural prices. This tension reached a memorable rhetorical peak in 1896, when the young politician William Jennings Bryan delivered his famous Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention, forcefully arguing against a strict gold standard and declaring, in a line that became instantly and enduringly famous, that humanity should not be crucified upon a cross of gold. Bryan won his party's nomination for president on the strength of that speech, though he ultimately lost the general election, and the United States continued along a broadly gold-based path for several more decades afterward. It's a genuinely useful historical episode to sit with, because it's a reminder that debates over what should back a currency and who benefits from a more flexible versus a more rigid monetary system have never been purely technical questions. They've consistently been deeply tied up with much broader questions of economic fairness and political power, echoing forward into plenty of monetary debates that continue in various forms today. The Great Depression, which we touched on briefly a moment ago, is worth spending a little more calm, careful time on, because it reshaped banking itself almost as significantly as it reshaped the gold standard. In the United States, the early 1930s saw a wave of bank runs, moments where a large number of depositors, worried about a bank's stability, all rushed to withdraw their funds at once, which, given the fractional reserve system we discussed back in Chapter 3, could turn a bank that was fundamentally sound into one that genuinely failed, simply because no bank holding only a fraction of its deposits in reserve can survive every depositor demanding their money back on the very same day. Thousands of American banks failed during this period, wiping out the savings of a great many ordinary depositors. In response, the U.S. government established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, in 1933, guaranteeing depositors' funds up to a certain limit, even if their bank failed, a genuinely important innovation in maintaining public trust in the banking system, since a depositor who knows their money is protected by government-backed insurance has far less reason to panic and join a bank run in the first place, which makes runs themselves considerably less likely to occur or spiral out of control. Similar deposit insurance systems were adopted, in various forms, by many other countries over the following decades and remain a foundational, if quietly unglamorous, piece of banking stability around much of the world today. It's worth adding a little more color to the Bretton Woods story too, since the conference itself involved the fascinating clash of ideas between two of the 20th century's most influential economists. The British delegation was led by John Maynard Keynes, who arrived with an ambitious proposal for an entirely new international reserve currency, which he called the banker, intended to sit above and independent of any single nation's own currency, reducing the risks associated with the peg-to-the-dollar system that Bretton Woods ultimately adopted instead. The American delegation, led by Treasury official Harry Dexter White, favored a system built more directly around the US dollar, reflecting America's dominant economic and financial position in the aftermath of the war. White's vision, broadly speaking, is the one that ultimately prevailed, given the sheer economic weight the United States carried at that particular moment in history. And it's an interesting historical what-if to sit with. A world where Keynes's more currency-neutral banker proposal had won out instead might have faced a rather different set of pressures than the ones that eventually led to the Nixon shock some 3 decades later. Following that 1971 shift to floating fiat currencies, the 1970s brought a genuinely difficult and closely studied period of high inflation across much of the developed world, a combination of factors including sharp increases in oil prices and the general adjustment pains of moving away from the old, more rigid Bretton Woods framework. In the United States, this period is often associated with the arrival of Paul Volcker as chair of the Federal Reserve in 1979, who pursued a deliberately aggressive campaign of high interest rates specifically aimed at breaking the back of persistent inflation, even though doing so meant tolerating a genuinely painful, if temporary, economic slowdown along the way. By the mid-1980s, inflation in the U.S. had fallen substantially from its late 1970s peaks, and the episode is still widely studied today as a defining example of a central bank prioritizing long-term monetary credibility and stability over short-term economic comfort. A difficult and genuinely consequential balancing act that echoes the same basic tension we've traced in different forms all the way back through this video, from Diocletian's price edict to the discipline required to keep a fiat currency trustworthy in the first place. There's a useful regional parallel worth mentioning here too, one that quietly foreshadows a much more recent and more famous monetary experiment. In 1865, France, Belgium, Italy, and Switzerland formed what's known as the Latin Monetary Union, agreeing to mint their respective national gold and silver coins to a common, shared standard of weight and purity, so that French, Belgian, Italian, and Swiss coins could circulate and be accepted interchangeably across all 4 countries' borders, without needing to be exchanged or converted first. Greece and several other countries joined in the years that followed. The arrangement worked reasonably well for a period, easing cross-border trade and travel across a meaningful stretch of Western Europe, though it eventually came under strain from many of the same pressures we've discussed elsewhere in this chapter, differing national fiscal discipline, and the broader monetary chaos brought on by the First World War, and it was formally dissolved in the 1920s. It's a genuinely interesting historical dry run for an idea that would resurface, in a considerably more ambitious and more institutionally robust form at the end of the 20th century, when a number of European countries once again pursued a shared currency, this time creating the euro, which we won't cover in detail in this particular video, but which sits, historically, as a direct conceptual descendant of exactly this same 19th century impulse toward monetary union across national borders. Domestically within the United States, it's worth adding a bit more texture to the Great Depression era we discussed a moment ago. In March of 1933, newly inaugurated President Franklin Roosevelt declared a nationwide bank holiday, temporarily closing every bank in the country for several days, specifically to halt the spiraling wave of bank runs and give federal regulators time to examine each bank's finances and reopen only those judged to be genuinely sound. Later that same year, the United States also moved away from the domestic gold standard, making it illegal, for a time, for American citizens to privately hold significant quantities of gold coin or bullion, and allowing the government considerably more flexibility to expand the money supply in response to the ongoing economic crisis. A genuinely dramatic, if calmly and deliberately executed, illustration of just how far a government's approach to its own currency can shift in response to sufficiently serious economic circumstances, and a domestic echo of the broader international move away from rigid gold backing that would fully complete itself, worldwide, with the Nixon shock nearly 4 decades later. With gold now fully out of the picture as money's formal anchor, and currencies floating freely against one another, the stage was set for the next major transformation in the history of money, one that had actually been quietly building in the background since the mid-20th century. Running in parallel with everything we've just discussed, the shift away from physical cash altogether toward credit, electronic transfers, and, eventually, purely digital money. That's exactly where we're headed next. Let's shift now from the grand, national-scale story of gold and central banks, back down to something a little more personal and everyday, how the money in an ordinary person's pocket or wallet gradually stopped being physical at all. The idea of buying something now and paying for it later is, in one sense, almost as old as money itself. We touched on early credit and debt systems all the way back in our first chapter in ancient Mesopotamia. But the modern idea of consumer credit, extended by businesses specifically to help ordinary people afford everyday and household purchases, really took shape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through what were called installment plans. Companies selling relatively expensive household goods. Sewing machines were an early, particularly influential example, especially through the Singer Sewing Machine Company. Realized that many potential customers simply couldn't pay the full price up front, but could comfortably afford small, regular payments spread out over months. This innovation dramatically expanded who could afford these products, and it introduced a genuinely important shift in everyday economic behavior and expectation. The idea that ownership and full payment didn't need to happen at exactly the same moment, that a trusted, ongoing payment relationship could bridge the gap between wanting something and having fully paid for it. Automobiles, arriving on a large scale in the early 20th century, accelerated this trend considerably, since a car represented a genuinely large purchase for most households, well beyond what the vast majority of people could pay in a single lump sum. Dedicated auto financing companies emerged specifically to offer installment loans for car purchases, and by the 1920s, a large and growing share of new cars in the United States were being bought on credit rather than paid for outright. A pattern that would go on to become entirely unremarkable and routine across a huge range of major purchases in the decades that followed. The specific idea of a dedicated card, carried in a wallet, that could be used to make purchases at many different businesses rather than credit tied to one single store or company, traces back to a now famous story from 1949. A businessman named Frank McNamara, dining at a restaurant in New York, realized partway through the meal that he'd left his wallet behind. The awkward moment reportedly stuck with him, and he went on to found Diners Club, launching what's widely credited as the first modern charge card in 1950, a small card that let members dine at a network of participating restaurants and settle the full bill once a month, rather than needing to carry cash for every meal. It began as a fairly exclusive, relatively small-scale service for a limited network of restaurants in New York. But the underlying idea, a single card backed by a trusted third party, accepted across many different unrelated businesses, was genuinely novel, and it spread quickly. Banks soon recognized the broader potential in this idea, well beyond restaurants. In 1958, Bank of America launched the Bank AmeriCard, generally regarded as the first true general-purpose credit card, usable at a wide and growing range of participating merchants for many different kinds of everyday purchases, not just dining. This card would later be spun off into its own independent company and, in 1976, rebranded under a name that's become one of the most recognized in the world, Visa. A competing group of banks organized a similar, competing card network around the same period, which would eventually become MasterCard. Together, these two networks quietly built the essential infrastructure underlying almost every card payment made anywhere in the world today. A system for authorizing transactions, moving funds between banks, and managing the risk of unpaid balances, all happening within a few seconds, behind the scenes, every single time someone hands over a card. Alongside the credit card, another quiet piece of everyday financial infrastructure emerged in the 1960s, the automated teller machine, or ATM. Several inventors and engineers around the world worked on closely related ideas around a similar time. A Scottish-born inventor named John Shepherd Barron is often credited with installing one of the very first cash machines at a Barclays branch in London in 1967, while, separately, Don Wetzel led a team developing a broadly similar concept in the United States around the same period. Early ATMs used various methods for identifying an authorized user, including, in some early versions, punched paper vouchers or checks, before the now familiar combination of a magnetic stripe card and a personal identification number, or PIN, became the standard approach. The ATM represented a genuinely significant, if quietly unglamorous, shift. For the first time, people could access their own money, in cash, outside of a bank's normal opening hours, from an automated machine rather than a human teller, laying essential groundwork for the broader shift toward automated, self-service banking that would continue to expand for decades afterward. Behind the scenes, banks were also developing faster, more automated ways of moving larger sums of money between institutions and across borders, well beyond what any individual credit card or ATM transaction involved. In 1973, a cooperative of European and North American banks established SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, creating a standardized, secure messaging system that let banks around the world reliably instruct each other to move funds on behalf of their customers, replacing older, considerably slower and less standardized methods, like telex messages and physical paper instructions. SWIFT doesn't actually move money itself, in a literal sense. It's better understood as an extremely secure, standardized messaging network, letting one bank tell another bank, with confidence and verification, exactly what needs to happen with a given sum of money. But it became, and remains today, an essential piece of the invisible plumbing underlying the vast majority of international financial transfers. As credit became more widespread and more central to everyday financial life, a related and genuinely important question grew increasingly pressing for banks and lenders. How do you fairly and consistently assess whether a given person is likely to repay a loan? Early approaches to this question were often fairly informal and, in practice, could be inconsistent or unfairly biased, relying heavily on a local loan officer's personal judgment and existing relationships. Over the course of the 20th century, and particularly from the 1950s onward, credit scoring gradually became more standardized and data-driven. The FICO score, introduced by the Fair Isaac Corporation in 1989, became one of the most widely used standardized measures in the United States, calculating a single numerical score based on factors like payment history, total amounts owed, and the length of someone's credit history, intended to give lenders a more consistent, more objective basis for assessing credit risk across a large and diverse pool of potential borrowers. The rise of personal computing and, later, the internet, brought the next major shift in this story, banking itself moving from physical branches and paper statements toward electronic and, eventually, entirely online systems. Early forms of electronic banking began appearing in the 1980s, often through dedicated telephone lines connecting directly to a bank's own computer systems, letting customers check balances or move money without visiting a branch in person. The wider adoption of the internet through the 1990s accelerated this shift dramatically. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, online banking, letting customers check statements, pay bills, and transfer funds through a standard web browser, had become widely available and increasingly normal across much of the developed world, and it continued expanding steadily as broadband internet access became more widespread. Card payment technology itself continued to evolve during this same period, aimed largely at improving both convenience and security. The older magnetic stripe, which stored account information in a fairly simple, relatively easy-to-copy format, gradually gave way, starting in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, to chip-based cards using a more secure standard called EMV, named for the three organizations, Europay, MasterCard, and Visa, that jointly developed it. Chip technology made it considerably harder to clone a card's information compared to the older magnetic stripe, meaningfully reducing certain categories of card fraud. Contactless payment technology followed shortly after, letting a card, or increasingly a smartphone or smartwatch, communicate securely with a payment terminal over a very short range using radio signals, letting a purchase be completed with a simple tap rather than requiring the card to be physically inserted or swiped at all. The rise of the internet also gave birth to entirely new categories of digital payment services, designed specifically for a world where more and more commerce was happening online rather than in person. PayPal, founded in the late 1990s, became one of the earliest and most influential examples, letting individuals and businesses send and receive money over the internet using little more than an email address, without needing to share sensitive bank or card details directly with an unfamiliar online seller. A genuinely important trust-building innovation during the early years of online shopping, when many people remained understandably nervous about entering their card details on unfamiliar websites. In the years that followed, a growing range of similar digital payment and money transfer services emerged, including peer-to-peer payment apps that let friends split a bill or repay a small personal debt with a few taps on a smartphone, gradually normalizing the idea of moving everyday, informal sums of money electronically, without cash or physical card ever needing to change hands at all. Smartphones, once they became widespread through the 2010s, brought a further layer of convenience and integration to this whole picture, letting a phone itself function as a payment device, securely storing card details and using the same short-range contactless technology as a physical card, alongside additional security measures like fingerprint or facial recognition to authorize each individual payment. Step back for a moment and look at the shape of everything covered in this chapter. Taken together over roughly the past century, and especially accelerating over the past few decades, physical cash has been steadily, gradually supplemented, and in a great many everyday transactions, largely replaced by an increasingly fast, increasingly automated, increasingly invisible layer of electronic infrastructure, cards, networks, messaging systems, apps, all working quietly together behind the scenes to move value between people and institutions in a fraction of a second, across any distance, without most of us ever needing to think about how any of it actually works underneath. It's worth adding a bit more detail to a couple of these threads, because each one carries a small, satisfying story of its own. Diners Club wasn't alone for long in the charge card business. American Express, already well established as a provider of traveler's checks, a secure, prepaid form of travel money introduced back in the 1890s specifically to protect travelers from theft while abroad, launched its own charge card in 1958, the same year as the Bank Americard, and the two companies would go on to develop somewhat different business models that still shape the payments landscape today. Diners Club and American Express, in their classic form, operated as charge cards requiring the full balance to be paid off every month, while Bank of America's Bank Americard pioneered the revolving credit model most people associate with a typical credit card today, allowing a balance to be carried forward from month to month in exchange for interest charges, a genuinely significant innovation in its own right, since it meant the card issuer was now extending an ongoing line of credit, not just a convenient payment mechanism, fundamentally reshaping how the whole industry made its money. The debit card followed a somewhat different path, emerging gradually through the 1970s and 80s as banks began linking plastic cards directly to a customer's own checking account balance, rather than to a separate line of credit, letting a purchase draw money directly and immediately from funds the customer already had on deposit. Early debit card systems, sometimes called EFTPOS, for electronic funds transfer at point of sale, required merchants to install specialized terminals capable of communicating electronically with a customer's bank in real time to verify and authorize a payment. Infrastructure that took considerable time and investment to roll out widely, but which, once established, became one of the most heavily used pieces of everyday financial infrastructure in the world, now handling an enormous share of everyday retail purchases across many countries. Contactless payment technology, interestingly, didn't actually originate with banks or credit card companies at all. It got a significant early push from an entirely different sector, public transit. London's Oyster card system, launched in 2003 for use across the city's buses and underground trains, demonstrated at genuinely large scale that a simple tap of a card against a reader could reliably process an enormous volume of transactions per day, quickly and consistently enough to keep up with the sheer pace of a major city's rush hour commute. Transit systems in a number of other major cities around the world adopted broadly similar contactless card systems around the same general period, and this proven, large-scale, real-world track record helped give banks and card networks the confidence to extend the same fundamental, contactless technology to everyday retail purchases more broadly over the years that followed, gradually replacing the need to insert or swipe a card at all for smaller, everyday transactions. One more thread worth including here because it offers a genuinely different and quietly inspiring path toward digital money than the story we've mostly been tracing through wealthy, already heavily banked economies, the rise of mobile money in parts of the developing world, and particularly the widely studied example of M-Pesa in Kenya. Launched in 2007 by the mobile network operator Safaricom, M-Pesa let users store and transfer money directly through their basic mobile phones, using simple text message-based commands, without requiring a traditional bank account at all. This turned out to be a genuinely significant development in a country, and a wider region, where a large share of the population had reliable access to a basic mobile phone, but far more limited access to conventional bank branches, especially in rural areas far from any major city. Rather than following the same path wealthier economies had taken, brick-and-mortar banks, then cards, then apps layered on top of existing bank accounts. Mobile money let many users effectively skip several of those earlier stages entirely, moving fairly directly from a largely cash-based economy to a mobile-based digital payment system. M-Pesa and similar mobile money services have since been credited by a number of researchers with meaningfully expanding financial access and economic opportunity across parts of East Africa, and the model has since been studied and adapted in various forms across a number of other countries facing broadly similar circumstances. It's a genuinely useful reminder that the story of money's digitization hasn't followed one single uniform path everywhere in the world. Different regions, starting from different existing infrastructure, have found their own routes to broadly the same underlying destination. It's worth going back a little further in time, too, to appreciate that paper-based electronic-style clearing wasn't entirely a 20th century invention. The check itself, a written instruction to a bank to pay a specific sum from one's own account, has roots stretching back to at least 17th century England, growing directly out of that same goldsmith banking tradition we discussed back in Chapter 3. As check use expanded through the 18th and 19th centuries, banks in London developed dedicated clearinghouses where representatives from different banks would physically gather each day to exchange the day's accumulated checks and settle the net differences owed between their institutions. A manual, paper-based version of exactly the same netting logic we described earlier with medieval Italian bills of exchange, and a direct organizational ancestor of the fully electronic, automated clearing systems that quietly settle the overwhelming majority of everyday bank transfers today. It's also worth reflecting, calmly, on a prediction that turned out to be considerably harder to fulfill than a lot of mid-20th century commentators expected: the fully cashless society. Articles and forecasts from as far back as the 1960s and 70s confidently predicted that physical cash would essentially disappear within a decade or two, replaced entirely by cards and electronic transfers. In practice, physical cash has proven remarkably persistent, even as digital payments have grown to dominate an ever larger share of everyday transaction value, particularly in wealthier economies. Cash still offers a few genuinely distinct practical advantages that have helped it hang on longer than many mid-century forecasters expected. It works without any electricity, network connection, or functioning payment terminal. It doesn't require a bank account at all, which matters considerably for people who remain outside the formal banking system for one reason or another, and it leaves no digital record of a given transaction, which some people continue to value for reasons of personal privacy. It's a nice, gentle reminder that even in a story defined again and again by one technology gradually displacing an older one, displacement in the history of money has rarely meant complete, total disappearance. Cowrie shells, cattle, and weighed silver all faded from everyday use, only very gradually, over centuries, rather than vanishing the instant something more convenient came along. That steady, decades-long march toward digital, electronic money set the stage for one final, genuinely novel development in this whole long story. One that didn't just digitize existing money, moving traditional currency through faster electronic channels, but attempted something considerably more ambitious, creating an entirely new kind of money altogether, one that doesn't rely on any single central bank, government, or trusted institution standing behind it at all. That's cryptocurrency, and it's exactly where we're headed for our final chapter. Every form of money we've walked through so far in this video, shells, cattle, coins, paper receipts, credit cards, has shared one underlying feature, even as the physical form changed dramatically across thousands of years. Some trusted authority or institution sits behind it. A king guarantees a coin's purity. A goldsmith guarantees a receipt is good for real gold. A central bank guarantees a national currency's stability. A card network and a bank guarantee that a credit card payment will actually be honored. Cryptocurrency represents the first serious, widely adopted attempt in this entire long history to build a form of money that doesn't rely on any single trusted central authority at all. And to understand how that's even possible, we need to go back a little further than Bitcoin itself, to a smaller community of researchers and privacy advocates working through the 1980s and 1990s. A loosely organized group who came to be known as the cypherpunks, active particularly through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, shared a common interest in using cryptography, the mathematics of secure, verifiable communication, to protect individual privacy and autonomy in an increasingly digital world, including, for some members of this community, a specific interest in creating digital forms of money that didn't require trusting a bank or government intermediary with every transaction. A computer scientist named David Shom, working somewhat independently but closely aligned with these same underlying goals, developed some of the earliest practical cryptographic techniques for digital cash through the 1980s and founded a company called DigiCash in 1989 to try to bring these ideas to market. DigiCash offered a genuinely innovative early vision of private digital currency, but it struggled to gain widespread adoption during a period when online commerce itself was still in its infancy, and the company eventually folded in the late 1990s. Several other attempts at digital currency emerged around this same general period, including eGold, a service backed by actual physical gold reserves that gained a meaningful user base through the late 1990s and early 2000s before running into significant regulatory and fraud-related difficulties. Each of these earlier efforts, in its own way, was reaching for something that the underlying technology and surrounding infrastructure of the time wasn't quite ready to fully support, a pattern once again. That echoes back to that recurring theme from earlier in this video. Genuinely significant innovations often arrive well before the surrounding conditions are ready for them to fully take hold. The specific breakthrough that made Bitcoin possible arrived in a research paper published in October of 2008, in the middle of a serious global financial crisis, authored under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. a name whose real identity remains unknown and unconfirmed to this day, despite considerable speculation and research over the years. The paper described a system called Bitcoin, and it solved a specific, long-standing technical problem that had stumped earlier attempts at fully decentralized digital currency. How do you prevent someone from spending the same digital token twice, without any central authority checking and verifying each transaction against a master ledger? This is sometimes called the double spending problem, and it's a genuinely tricky puzzle, because unlike a physical coin, which can only be in one person's hand at any given moment, a simple digital file can, in principle, be copied and sent to multiple people simultaneously. Nakamoto's solution was the blockchain, and it's worth walking through calmly because the underlying idea, once you slow it down, is genuinely elegant, even though it gets described in a lot of confusing, jargon-heavy language elsewhere. Instead of one central, trusted institution keeping the official record of who owns what, Bitcoin maintains its transaction record across a large distributed network of independent computers called nodes, each holding an identical, continuously updated copy of the complete transaction history. When someone wants to send Bitcoin to someone else, that transaction gets broadcast out to this network, and a specific subset of participants, called miners, compete to bundle up a batch of recent, pending transactions into a new block, which then gets cryptographically linked to the previous block in the chain, hence the name blockchain, a continuously growing chain of linked, time-stamped batches of transaction records. The genuinely clever part is how the network gets all of these independent, mutually distrustful participants to agree on a single, shared version of this transaction history, without needing to trust each other or any central authority. Bitcoin uses a mechanism called proof of work, requiring miners to solve an extremely difficult, computationally intensive mathematical puzzle in order to have their proposed new block accepted by the rest of the network. This puzzle is deliberately, intentionally hard to solve, but, importantly, very easy for other participants to quickly verify once a valid solution has been found. This asymmetry, hard to solve, easy to check, is the real engine of trust underlying the entire system. Because producing a valid new block requires such a substantial, real-world investment of computing power and electricity, it becomes prohibitively expensive and impractical for any single bad actor to rewrite the transaction history or spend the same coins twice, since doing so successfully would require them to outcompute the combined computing power of the network's honest majority, an increasingly difficult feat as the network has grown larger over time. The first ever block in the Bitcoin blockchain, called the Genesis block, was mined by Nakamoto in January of 2009, embedding within it a small, quietly pointed reference to a newspaper headline from that same day about a bank bailout, a detail widely interpreted as a deliberate commentary on the traditional financial system's vulnerabilities, arriving as it did in the immediate aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. For its first year or two of existence, Bitcoin was a genuinely obscure, niche project traded almost entirely among a small community of cryptography and computing enthusiasts, with no established market value at all. One frequently retold story from this early period involves a programmer who, in May of 2010, paid 10,000 bitcoins for 2 pizzas, in what's generally regarded as the first known real-world commercial transaction using Bitcoin. A transaction now remembered with a certain wry fondness within the cryptocurrency community, given how dramatically the relative value of that currency would go on to shift in the years that followed. As Bitcoin slowly gained more attention and adoption through the early to mid-2010s, a wider ecosystem of alternative cryptocurrencies, sometimes called altcoins, began to emerge, each typically built on the same fundamental blockchain concept, but experimenting with different technical approaches or different goals. Ethereum, proposed in a 2013 paper by a young programmer named Vitalik Buterin and launched in 2015, introduced a particularly influential extension to the core blockchain idea. Rather than a blockchain that could only record simple currency transactions, Ethereum built a blockchain capable of running small, self-executing computer programs, called smart contracts, directly on the network itself. This opened the door to a much wider range of possible applications built on top of blockchain technology, well beyond simply sending currency from one person to another. Automated agreements that execute exactly as programmed without requiring a trusted intermediary to enforce them for things like lending, insurance, or the creation and trading of entirely new kinds of digital assets. One recurring challenge across the early cryptocurrency world was volatility. The value of Bitcoin and most other cryptocurrencies has, throughout their history, tended to swing considerably, sometimes dramatically, over relatively short periods of time, which makes an asset genuinely difficult to use as an everyday medium of exchange, even if it might function reasonably well as a store of value or a speculative investment for some holders. This particular challenge gave rise to a category called stablecoins, cryptocurrencies, specifically designed to maintain a steady, predictable value, most commonly by being pegged one-to-one to a traditional currency, like the US dollar, and backed by reserves of that currency, or closely related assets held by the issuing organization. Stablecoins have come to play a significant practical role within the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem, offering a way to move value across blockchain networks quickly and globally, while largely avoiding the price volatility associated with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin itself. Governments and central banks around the world, watching this whole ecosystem develop over roughly the past decade and a half, have responded in a genuinely wide range of ways, reflecting just how novel and, in some ways, still unsettled this whole area of monetary history remains. Some countries have moved to regulate cryptocurrency fairly closely, treating it broadly similarly to other existing financial assets for tax and consumer protection purposes. A smaller number of countries have experimented with more restrictive approaches, and a growing number of central banks around the world have begun actively researching, and in some cases piloting, what are called central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. Essentially, a digital form of a country's existing official currency, issued and backed directly by the central bank itself, combining some of the technical convenience associated with digital and cryptocurrency systems with the traditional trust and stability of an established national currency and central banking institution. Several countries have already launched limited pilot programs exploring exactly what a CBDC might look like in practice, and it's a genuinely active, ongoing area of research and policy discussion across much of the world's financial system right now. It's worth adding a little more calm detail to Bitcoin's own journey through its first decade and a half, because the underlying technology has continued to evolve in some genuinely interesting ways since Nakamoto's original 2008 paper. The proof-of-work mining process we described earlier started out, in Bitcoin's earliest years, as something an ordinary person could meaningfully participate in using nothing more than a regular home computer's processor. As the network grew, and as more participants competed to solve those computational puzzles, the effective difficulty of mining rose considerably, and the hardware used for mining evolved rapidly in response. First toward more powerful graphics cards, originally designed for video games and other graphically intensive computing tasks, and eventually towards specialized computer chips called ASICs, short for application-specific integrated circuits, designed and manufactured for the sole purpose of performing these particular mining calculations as efficiently as possible. This progression, from home computer to specialized industrial hardware, mirrors, in a smaller and more compressed way, a similar historical arc we discussed back in Chapter 1 and 2 regarding precious metals. The easily accessible surface resources tend to get claimed early, and extracting further value increasingly requires more specialized, more capital-intensive equipment and effort as time goes on. This growth in mining hardware and overall network activity has, in turn, drawn attention to the substantial amount of electricity the proof-of-work process consumes at a global scale, since so many participants around the world are simultaneously running energy-intensive hardware, competing to solve the same computational puzzles. This has become a genuinely active area of ongoing research, debate, and engineering effort within the wider cryptocurrency world. One significant response came from Ethereum, the smart contract platform we discussed a moment ago, which completed a major technical transition in September of 2022, often referred to as the merge, shifting its underlying consensus mechanism away from proof-of-work entirely toward an alternative approach called proof-of-stake. Rather than requiring participants to compete using raw computational power and electricity, proof-of-stake instead requires participants to lock up, or stake, a quantity of the cryptocurrency itself as a form of collateral, with the right to help validate new transactions allocated based on the size of that stake, and with dishonest behavior punished by forfeiting some of the staked funds. This approach reduced Ethereum's overall energy consumption very substantially, and it represents a genuinely significant, ongoing area of technical experimentation within the broader field, as different blockchain projects continue exploring different trade-offs between security, decentralization, and energy efficiency. The broader cryptocurrency world has also had its own share of institutional growing pains along the way, not unlike the growing pains banking itself went through in earlier centuries, from the Fugger family's overexposed loans to the bank runs of the Great Depression. Mentine. Gox, once the world's largest Bitcoin exchange, handling a substantial share of all Bitcoin trading activity at its peak in the early 2010s, collapsed in early 2004 after revealing that a very large quantity of customer Bitcoin had been lost. in circumstances that took years of subsequent investigation and legal proceedings to fully untangle. The episode became an early, widely discussed lesson within the cryptocurrency community about the risks of storing funds on a centralized exchange rather than in a wallet directly controlled by the individual owner, and it contributed to a broader, ongoing conversation within the space about security practices, regulatory oversight, and the trade-offs between convenience and direct personal control over one's own digital assets. As the wider ecosystem grew through the later 2010s and into the 2020s, including a wave of new token offerings in 2017, and later a period of considerable public interest in non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, representing unique digital ownership records for digital or digitally linked assets. Regulators in many countries gradually developed more comprehensive frameworks aimed at bringing greater consumer protection and oversight to this fast-evolving corner of the financial world, a pattern that, once again, echoes plenty of earlier moments in this video, where a genuinely novel financial innovation was followed, sometimes swiftly and sometimes only after a rocky patch or two, by a period of institutional maturation and regulatory catch-up. On the central bank digital currency front we touched on a moment ago, it's worth naming a concrete, well-documented example to make the concept feel a little less abstract. China's digital yuan, formerly called the ECNY, has been under active development and limited pilot testing since around 2014, with expanded public trials rolled out across a number of Chinese cities in the years since, letting participating residents use a government-issued digital currency, functionally similar to cash but existing entirely in digital form, for everyday retail purchases, alongside China's already extensive existing mobile payment ecosystem. Other central banks around the world, including in Europe and a number of smaller economies in the Caribbean and elsewhere, have pursued their own research projects and, in some cases, limited real-world pilots, exploring what a state-backed digital currency might look like, how it might coexist with existing commercial banking and payment systems, and what trade-offs it might involve around privacy, financial oversight, and the practical mechanics of monetary policy in an increasingly digital-first world. It remains, even now, a genuinely open, actively evolving area of monetary history, being written in real time. A small, almost affectionate piece of cryptocurrency culture is worth including here too, because it's a nice illustration of just how young and informal parts of this particular chapter in monetary history still are, compared to the many centuries of tradition and formal institutional development we've traced through most of this video. In December of 2011, a member of an early online Bitcoin discussion forum, in the middle of an evidently frustrating and possibly not entirely sober late-night post about the cryptocurrency's price swings, misspelled the word HOLD as HODL, while declaring an intention to keep his coins regardless of the market's ups and downs. The typo caught on almost immediately within the small community, and HODL has since become a widely used piece of cryptocurrency slang, generally understood as shorthand for a long-term, patient holding strategy through periods of price volatility. A nice, if unusually casual, example of language and culture still visibly forming in real time around a genuinely new financial technology, in much the same way, if considerably faster and more informally, that earlier chapters of this video have shown language quietly forming around money across thousands of years, from the shekel to the word salary itself. It's also worth noting, calmly and without dwelling on it, that the same qualities that make cryptocurrency appealing to many legitimate users, the ability to transfer value across borders without requiring a traditional financial intermediary, also drew early attention from regulators and law enforcement concerned about illicit use, most notably in the shutdown of an online marketplace called Silk Road in 2013, which had used Bitcoin as a payment mechanism for illegal transactions and became an early, widely publicized flashpoint in the broader public conversation about cryptocurrency regulation. Episodes like this contributed meaningfully to the more comprehensive regulatory frameworks that have gradually developed around cryptocurrency exchanges and services in the years since, requiring many of them to follow identity verification and anti-money laundering procedures broadly similar to those long required of traditional banks. Another example, in its own way, of a genuinely new financial technology gradually being woven into the same broader web of institutional trust and oversight that every earlier form of money in this video eventually settled into as well. On a more technical note, as Bitcoin's own network grew busier over the years, developers also worked on ways to help it handle a larger volume of everyday, smaller transactions more efficiently, without every single purchase needing to be individually recorded on the main blockchain itself. Given how energy-intensive and comparatively slow that main chain's transaction processing can be, the Lightning Network, developed and gradually rolled out beginning in 2018, offers one widely used approach to this challenge, allowing participants to open secure, direct payment channels with each other, conducting a potentially large number of smaller transactions instantly and with minimal cost, before eventually settling a final net balance back to the main Bitcoin blockchain. A layered, two-tiered approach that echoes, in a distant, more technical way, that same medieval Italian practice of netting many individual transactions together and settling only the final balance between banking houses. A reminder that some of the most practical solutions to the basic logistical challenges of moving money efficiently seem to get quietly reinvented, in one technical form or another, across every era of this long history. Stepping back, calmly, from all of these very recent developments and looking at the whole sweep of everything we've covered across this entire video, a clear and genuinely reassuring pattern emerges, one that's been quietly present in every single chapter, in every single era, across every different culture we've touched on. Money has never actually been a fixed, unchanging thing. It has always been a technology, a practical, evolving tool that different societies have built and rebuilt, again and again, to solve the same small handful of underlying, remarkably consistent problems. How do you reliably store value for later? How do you conveniently exchange value with people you may not know or trust personally? And how do you meaningfully compare the worth of very different things against one shared common standard? Cowrie shells, cattle, weighed silver, stamped coins, goldsmith receipts, gold-backed banknotes, plastic cards, and now cryptographically secured digital ledgers. Every single one of these has been, underneath its very different physical or technical form, essentially the same underlying idea, reinvented again and again for a changing world. A shared, sufficiently trusted system for keeping track of value, so that people don't need to personally, individually trust every single person they ever trade with. That's really the whole story, running quietly underneath every chapter of this long, calm walk through history. Not a story about metal or paper or code, but a story about trust and about how remarkably resourceful people have been across thousands and thousands of years in finding new ways to build it, extend it, and, when it occasionally breaks down, patiently rebuild it once again. Whatever form money takes next, and there will almost certainly be a next form, just as there always has been before, it will very likely be shaped by that same underlying ancient logic, a system good enough and trusted enough that a stranger on the other side of the world is willing to accept it in exchange for something real.